Welcome to the 3Haunted podcast, where we bring you all things horror, supernatural, folklore, mythology, and all things that go bump in the night.
Hey, what's up, guys? I'm your co-host, Kevin, K-Daddy from Dirty South, the ATL, Hotlanta, Georgia. I'm a post-production master, filmmaker, and horror nerd.
Hey guys, this is your co-host Ashley, Gorilla Girl filmmaker, lunar goddess, and cinephile.
And I'm your co-host, John Thomas, ghost hunter, super smartass, and film lover extraordinaire.
What's up, ghouls, gals, and visitors from other planets? In today's podcast, we're talking about aliens and UFOs. Are aliens real? What exactly are UFOs? Is the government behind it all? Grab your binoculars, open up those X-Files, and tune in as the 3Haunted crew beams you up into the world of extraterrestrials.
But first, here's Ashley with a word from our podcast network.
Are you looking for more awesome podcasts? Head on over to withoutyourhead.com for access to the Without Your Head podcast network, where you'll find a variety of podcasts sure to keep you entertained and coming back for more.
And welcome back, Meta Pals. Today we have a very special guest, David Gunn. David, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you very much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Like what brought you here?
I guess the first thing that I would say is, I came on because Ashley had communicated with me and she had asked me to come on. And obviously I have a long relationship with her, a friendship that goes back many years. But she brought up the fact that you guys are going to be talking about UFOs or aliens or anything pretty much related to that category. And since I have kind of a passing interest in it, I would never consider myself an expert in any regard. But I'm probably older than you guys, so I've kind of grown up during a period of time where there was all kinds of recognitions of UFOs and aliens and how they changed during, the way they were approached by the media or just public knowledge and dissemination as well. So it felt like it was something that I might be interested in talking about. So just so you know, in regards to my own background, I'm not any kind of ufologist or anything like that. I'm an editor, I'm a videographer. I'm also a graphic designer. My brothers and I are also kind of quasi filmmakers, but we do creative projects as well. We had a little offshoot that we did where we kind of satired this very subject matter because we had spent many years watching other groups take the idea of aliens and UFOs and kind of turn it into a cottage industry where, it wasn't really taken seriously. It was just kind of lampooned. But with all that being said, I do take it seriously. Doesn't mean that I'm a fanatic or that I believe every single thing that's written about or talked about. But I think it's a conversation worth having.
Well, welcome. We're excited to have you on.
Welcome. And Ashley and John, what about you guys? Where do you guys fall within UFOs, and where do you fall in terms of how much do you know?
I'd like to call myself an expert ufologist. Is that what it was? Because I watched every episode of The X-Files. So I'd like to think I'm an expert. Just kidding. I actually don't know much. I did watch all of The X-Files. I was a pretty big fanatic on that kind of stuff. I've grown up on the whole sci-fi genre. But in terms of knowing much about it, I think I have just like a base knowledge of what I've been able to Google over the years. I'm not like that dude on, what is it? The National Geographic or Travel Channel or whatever with the poofy hair. Like, it's the aliens. What about you, John?
I mean, I'm with you right there. I did watch the X-Files. I definitely want to believe. I think I'm more of a believer than I am a skeptic. I'm still, just curious as to what's flying around. I've seen some weird shit up in the air. I don't know. So yeah, I don't know. We'll just figure it out.
All right. So you mentioned you've been around a while, David. What is the earliest memory you have of like the alien or UFO phenomenon in the news or, being spread around? Because we didn't have the interwebs back then. That's fairly new for all of us. So what'd you hear and where did you hear it from?
Okay, well, I'm 49 years old. So my childhood pretty much takes place in the 1970s. and in the 1980s. And I would say that my exposure to UFOs and to aliens came about during that time, usually probably through TV and through newspaper accounts. But I would say that the most of it really started to happen when I would watch shows like In Search of or That's Incredible. That was a program that would oftentimes look at, things that couldn't be explained. And then as the years went on, I began to see films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and stuff like that. But I would say that it really didn't become a big thing for me until I was somewhat older, maybe like closer to 15. My mother and father were both in the Air Force. My mom was an RN, and my dad was a pilot who started as a navigator, and eventually he became a captain. He served in the service, the Air Force, during the mid to late 1960s and the early 1970s. And I remember my dad having a conversation with me one time because I had asked him about something that we had watched on TV, and I think it was talking about UFO abduction cases, and I think it might have been the Betty and Barney. I can't remember their last name, but they were at the time they were a high-profile abduction case that was talked about. And my dad had told me about an experience that he had when he was in the Air Force, and that they were flying a large transport cargo coming from Europe and flying back to the continental United States. And during the night of their flight plan, they began to become paralleled by what he described as a bright object. And the bright object paralleled them for quite a bit of time, and then it disappeared, and then it came back, but now it was on the opposite side of them. And they hadn't changed their course at all. And my dad is a practical man, so he's not one prone to fancy or anyone who's going to just willingly be like, oh yeah, it's a bunch of green men. And so when he would talk about it, the way that he explained it was that eventually this object was with them for probably like 15 to 20 minutes. And it eventually flew towards them and across their flight path. And at that time, he was explaining to me that as an officer in the Air Force, as a pilot, that when these things would happen, and apparently they happened quite a bit, the mentality that existed was that you don't report it. You don't talk about it, because if you do, one of two things was going to happen to you. It would be the end of your career, and then you would be spending the rest of your life having to fill out reports. So pretty much every pilot in the Air Force, and this would even apply to when they left the service and they would go into private aviation, working for the airlines. It was the same mentality. It was like, you don't talk about it. But that he talked about, and he told me then that, the only way that he could explain it to me was like, I can't tell you what they were. I can't tell you that they were little green men or anything like that. I can tell you what they couldn't be. And he, as an officer, and granted, he wasn't privy to black op projects or anything like that, but during that point in time, which would have been the late 1960s, they didn't have anything that could do what it was that object did. And he knew that. He also recognized, and he would explain to me, that the thing that it could do, if it had a human occupant in it, the human couldn't handle that, because the human body has to follow the laws of physics and G-forces, the way that your blood circulates through your circulation system. And the way that object could move and do its type of stuff, there's no way a person could be in that. So what he and the rest of his co-pilots and them would end up doing was like saying, hey, we saw this. We know it's not ours. We know it's probably doesn't belong to anybody else. We don't know what it is. And it has to just leave it at that and then move on. And when my dad had that conversation with me and told me that, I asked him, so do you think that these people were abducted? And he would say, he's like, well, I don't know if they were, but I don't doubt that there are things that are out there that are in the skies, because they've been there. They've been there since I was in flight training and probably before. So after having that conversation with my dad, as I grew up and got older, again, because I'm older, from the 70s, going into the 80s, going into the 90s, you began to see the explosion of all of these types of events that were normally not really talked about, but they were kind of like, people knew about them more as folklore, like the Roswell, New Mexico crash, right? But as we marched through the years, things began to kind of blow up. And by the time we got to the 1990s, when I was living in California, that's when things really got big. Because you were talking about before about like watching the X-Files. You had the X-Files talking about the same subject matter. You had radio programs like Art Bell, who would talk to people about, accounts or crash sites or things like that. Became aware to people about the whole idea of Area 51. These were things that, normally people didn't know about, But as we marched through time, it just kind of grew and grew and grew. And you guys probably were probably too little and probably weren't aware at the time. But there was a period of time in the 1990s when the Roswell, New Mexico crash became such a big deal that the United States Air Force actually came out and had a press conference to try to explain away what happened at Roswell, New Mexico. And they offered up these dummies that they said were confused for alien bodies. They tried to tell everyone that it was all a part of just a weather balloon project and stuff like that. But what was so funny about it was we had gone decades of them never addressing it, but only because it began to become this big giant thing in the media and in popular culture that the United States Air Force felt that they had to go on live TV and do a press conference about it. So again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to ramble because there's a lot of stuff that you can go into and pick apart. But it started for me when I was a childhood in the 70s and 80s, because all the stuff that we're talking about was stuff that was being talked about back then, before YouTube, before the internet, before any of that. There were books written, people would get together, there were conventions. This topic has existed even before the advent of popular culture. Not to sound like that guy you were talking about, but there are historical accounts going from the Bible onward of people, civilizations who didn't have distractions like we do, right? Where people are always in their phone or watching TV. But you had civilizations where it was their job to watch the sky because they had to plan for a season. They had to be aware of the weather. And they would make accounts of things that were happening in the sky that were not normal. But for me, that's where it really kind of started, was in my childhood during that time period.
But I like what you mentioned about how it goes before, it precedes TV and it was happening, but people weren't really talking about it because you have cultures, like you said, that it's been happening for so long. People have been talking about it or documenting it, maybe not using the exact same words, but the context is the same, right? What's going on is the same. And we see it especially in Northern America, if we're talking about the US, like in Montana and Wyoming, like the petroglyphs from the Native Americans about what they called the star people, people that are watching the sky for harvests, for seasons, the astronomy, and they're seeing things and then they're recording it in petroglyphs on rocks. And we found that, like, they've dated it. It's not new, it's not fake. Something's going on where people are accounting for visits. This is dated so old. And it's interesting that some of the Native American lore is grounded in this idea that they came from star people. And that's where they originate from, and that they visit whenever they like. And it's just like, holy cow, what? Someone's visiting you whenever they want from the sky? Who is it? But it's interesting. It's really neat. And you see it not just with like when the X-Files boomed and the internet started, people were able to connect and talk about their stories more. And the government's like, no, you're crazy. You see it even with Native Americans when it's introduced in the lore, like, oh, well, they didn't really start talking about that until the X-Files, until this. And it's like, no, it's been there. Just because it's now being put into book form and people are actually willing to talk about it more doesn't mean it didn't exist before. So I find that interesting. You see that paralleling with the different cultures.
I feel like that's been a common theme of a lot of the topics that we've been talking about, where like things occur and are reported all around the world very similarly in the eras before Google and easy communication. And it's amazing just how widespread everything can actually be.
Yeah, but you know what I find difficult with our other topics that we've had, like vampires, that was associated with different illnesses, right? Like the plague and illnesses from back in that time that didn't have any kind of name for it then. So they're like, it's a vampire. And you have like demon possession, which we're finding is associated with potentially like schizophrenia. Not all of it, but some of it, right? There are explanations that can kind of go along with it. But with UFOs and aliens, especially when we're talking about way back during the times of petroglyphs, like thousands of years ago, what do you have for that? Like, what is the explanation? People coming from the sky. And yeah, okay, maybe it's hallucinations, but you have so many stories even now, right? Of people like, I'm just driving home from work and this happened to me. Or I woke up in the middle of the night, went down to my kitchen, and there's someone standing in my kitchen. I don't know. A lot of it we've discussed has like explanations that people could write off that are, okay, that's logical. That's believable as maybe one explanation. But with this, it's like, I got nothing. Maybe now it's easier to write off because we do have so many countries with so much advanced technology that it's like, okay, well, that could be anybody testing something they're not admitting to having in their arsenal, right? We're even going thousands of years before that. We're talking about Native American land, time where there was nothing else. We're not flying planes. The Wright brothers haven't even been born yet. What about that? Because that hasn't changed. They describe the same thing, the disc flying lights, and that description hasn't changed.
During the 90s was actually a really cool time period because it seemed like there were a lot of breakthroughs. Where it was like before, you had other TV shows like Sightings that came on and stuff like that. People were starting to address the topic, and they were starting to dedicate time and energy and effort into investigating it, right? And you had new sightings, right? There was the Phoenix Lights. There were all kinds of things that were beginning to kind of bubble and come to the top. And during that period of time, it was great, right? Because in a weird way, it was all before the year 2000, right? And before the year 2000 happened, things were kind of treated more seriously, at least by a lot more people. And it seemed like after we got past the year 2000 and the world didn't end, right? And then even after we got past 2012 and the world didn't end, it seemed like things changed. And it seemed like media, the way we consume media, the way that we don't trust media, we don't trust anything that anyone pretty much says. All these topics just kind of became a part of one giant thing that you could only look at as entertainment, right? And it seemed like it was no longer being taken seriously, or at least the amount of people who were looking at it seriously, it seemed to dissipate. And most of it was now just regulated for fodder, for TV shows, or for jokes. And again, this brings my point about Ancient Aliens, right? I've read the books of Zachariah Sitchin and Eric von Däniken and all of those guys. But on that show, Ancient Aliens, right, they milked it. They milked it for views and they milked it for advertising. That guy has become a meme because, the joke is, he's like, I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens. Whereas most people took a practical approach where they were like, okay, there is definitely 100% chance that you could entertain the idea that it would make sense that there would be other alien life in the universe, right? Because if you just look at the planet Earth, if you look at all the organisms and life forms that exist on our planet at the different levels, right? From human beings to animals, to microscopic organisms, to creatures that live almost below the tectonic plates. The range of different life forms you have just on one planet. It would be ridiculous to think that you couldn't extrapolate that and think that the infinity of the universe would have the same kind of petri dish. And so shows like Ancient Aliens, while I enjoyed them and got entertainment from them, eventually it seemed like these guys became a joke and no one was taking any of it very seriously.
It's like saying that, like, at the smallest level of what life is, like, to bacteria. Like, you can't tell me that bacteria can exist elsewhere. And so that's kind of where I hold on to it. It's like, do I think it's, a green alien? Probably not. But it just seems absolutely selfish in a way to say that, like, our planet can have bacteria growth and grow up into these living microorganisms, be it itty bitty or really big, and say that it can't be elsewhere.
But why can't it be green or gray or any spectrum? And John laughs. No, but I'm being serious because think about how the color of our own skin is determined. It's based on our genetics response to the sun, right? To David's point, we've already discovered there are other solar systems out there, right? With suns, their own versions of suns. So obviously, if a planet is far enough away from its own sun, it's going to harbor the same kind of atmosphere as ours or similar, right? Just based on how energy and chemistry and biology works. So it just has to be the right, and I say that loosely, distance to be able to foster life form in the way that we understand it on those planets. And even with that, I mean, we're making new discoveries every day. This is just a glimpse in time where we are evolving on our own planet. That time's going to go at some point, right? That's just how it works. Who's to say it's not planet jumping and not aliens, but this evolution of what we consider life? Maybe it's possible that some of these planets had life. That time came and went because our scope of life is really small in the grand scheme of the whole, universe lifespan. So I don't know. I think it's possible. And I think it's possible also that it's probably been everywhere at some point as heat sources and life sources that foster that environment for life form. It, comes up, rises up, and it maybe eventually goes away. And maybe we're baby forms in our, how old is the universe? We're kind of new on Earth in terms of how long we've been on here. It really hasn't been that long. So maybe there are some other planets that have had their own little life form going on for a while now. They're more advanced than we are. Look how far we've advanced in a short amount of time. I'm kind of rambling now. My brain's going in so many ways.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it was Mars that they said that it was at one point as green and blue as Earth before certain elemental changes, and it basically dried up and became what it is now.
I think that there's a lot there. And that's the thing that drives me crazy. Similar to David's point that like you had the 90s where they kind of took it seriously and a lot was being discussed about it. And then it became just a mockery and pop culture got a hold of it. And not that it made a mockery of it, but it became sensationalized and placed in the category of fantasy, escapism, and not real, versus treated as potentially a scientific thing. Because whenever something is treated truly scientific, we put a lot more resources into understanding it. And maybe there's stuff we don't know that is being researched about it. But I do think that a lot of what's being brought out now gets glossed over. And I don't know why. Like, for example, what was it? 2017, end of 2017. And this is going to sound political, but it's not political. So 2017, we have President Trump, right? And there was a lot of disrupt. And then during that same time, we had like a side note slip into our mainstream media of, look at this stuff. Look what Trump did. He was with a porn star. Oh my God. And then you have like this little footnote that said, by the way, UFOs are real. The government just released footage of the UFOs. The Pentagon is releasing statements like it's going against laws of motion and physics. We don't understand. We don't know what this is. We just don't know. Here's the footage. That's a big deal. Like that's a really big deal, right? Our government has not been like you said, they do not want to admit that kind of stuff. And here they are, official statements from the Pentagon saying we have no idea what this is. This goes against the laws of motion and physics. We don't know. Here's some videos. But then it's like a little side note when it really shouldn't that be what's being like front page news? I don't know. That's just me, but it felt like a big misdirection.
I think I remember that time period that you're talking about. And I also think during that time period, there was the release of Navy pilots that were tracking and following an object that was behaving erratically. And in fact, I think the pilot who was a part of that footage, who then I think left the service, I think a couple years later, I thought he was actually making the rounds and doing interviews. And I want to say I thought he was like on Joe Rogan's podcast and doing stuff like that. But you're right. But you see, that's where like there's a truth that comes out. But then at the same time, this is the problem with the subject matter and why it's like during the 70s to the 80s to the 90s, there was a pursuit for truth, right? And during that pursuit for truth, there were other truths that came into light, right? Now, going back to the late 60s and the 70s, we were told that the Air Force had dedicated their own investigative body into all this, and that was the Project Blue Book, right? But then years later, we would find out, and even from the man involved himself, I think Dr. J. Allen Hynek, we would find out the whole purpose behind Project Blue Book was not to prove anything, but it was to debunk everything, because they didn't want people talking about this and they didn't want people knowing about it. And so they would do everything they could to explain away every sighting, every encounter. So right there, you have a problem where it's like people are looking for the truth, and a truth is being obscured by a set of lies. And in that situation, you have your own government setting up a series of lies to obscure a truth. And then as we go through the decades, people still are looking for more and more truth. But it becomes more and more apparent that at the same time that you're trying to find out just the basic answers to what's going on, that there are people who are invested in making sure that you don't know what's going on for whatever their purposes are, right? There was the whole, I think it was the Majestic 12 document where they had figured out, they had decided amongst a panel of scientists that if the world were to find out that there was in fact any kind of alien race or any kind of alien technology, that it would mean an absolute breakdown in our societies, and it would be a breakdown in our spiritual beliefs. It would be a breakdown in our civilizations. So they decided, they felt it was more important that people never think that, or that they never believe that. And so if you have these kinds of walls that are set up from decade to decade to decade, I can't fully blame the entertainment industry 100% for why everyone takes things not so seriously anymore. You know, if there's these walls set up that are built to just kind of keep you in the dark, where it's like, well, okay, then maybe I am goofy thinking that there's a little green man, right? But most people, the whole point is, it's not that people were thinking that there were a bunch of green men running around in their backyards. They were just saying, hey, there is an object in the sky that's doing something that we can't do. So where does it come from? That's not people saying that they have an answer. That's people just looking for any kind of an answer that would explain what that technology is. And even if you would say, well, here in 2021, we have the technology, we have drone technology and stuff, I would still have to say that I think people would still be asking the same question, because the things that like my dad talked about, these are objects that are performing in a way that you just can't do. So what? It's mass illusions, it's mass hysteria. These pilots are having illusions, and the guys tracking it on radar, they're having illusions. It's like, no, there's something there. So what is it? So, you know, that period of time, you're right, when you bring up the point where it's like something gets released, but it gets released in such a way that it's treated as in like, oh yeah, by the way, there was an alien and he got killed and we buried it. It's like it's an afterthought. And it's like, well, wait a minute, that deserves complete and total attention. Why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we treating it like a serious matter? But in the way that it's delivered, you almost would get the impression that they don't want you to treat it like a serious subject. You know, they want you to just go on with your life, consume or distract yourself, whatever it is that keeps the society and the world going as normal. Don't look too deeply into these things. I totally accept that there are frauds, that there are people who throughout the years have done hoaxes, that who have built their own little cottage industries based on bullshit. You know, Art Bell had a successful radio program and he interviewed a lot of great people. He also interviewed some people who were scumbags. One was a guy named Courtney Brown, who was a part of a remote viewing program. And one of the things that he talked about that time was that they were remote viewing Mars, and that they were remote viewing the comet Hale-Bopp, and that they had seen another spaceship behind Comet Hale-Bopp, and then also that there were a civilization on Mars that was waiting to talk to us. Well, Courtney Brown turned out to be a fucking hoax, but he sold a lot of books before he got blown up, right? So I totally accept that when people talk about this, that there would be a pushback, because there is a lot of fraud, there is a lot of fake, there is a lot of just stupid bullshit. I accept that. But there are still people who are still just asking basic, serious questions, right? Without jumping off the cliff.
We saw that there was that one instance where across the world, those blue lights were appearing in the sky. Do you guys remember that? And it was being recorded because, and who knows how long this has been going on. We just happen to be in the age of the accessible camera and accessible uploading to YouTube. So I think, do I think it's a new phenomenon? Probably not. I just think we just happen to be in the right time where people can point something at the sky, hit record, and then upload it to YouTube in Australia. And someone in Spain can upload the same thing and say, look, I'm seeing it too, and so forth. And it goes around. And so I know that happened with the blue lights in the sky, and it was over Spain, the US, Australia. So it wasn't just us. And never got explained. But I think that a lot of government and a lot of media bank on the fact that humans in general have a short attention span. So we're going to lock onto something for a moment and it's going to be like, holy cow, what is that? Someone give me answers. What is that? I want to know what that is. Someone better give me answers. And then a few weeks from then, something else is going to come on. You know, some celebrity is going to have a scandal or some politician's going to do something silly, and we forget about the blue lights. And I think a lot of that happens, and it's happening in such a short amount of time. I know I was discussing this with a few people before where it's like, what are we being prepped for? With a lot of things going on, it does feel sometimes like as a people, we're being prepared for something. It's going to become one of those in your face things that extraterrestrial beings are real. and we have to acknowledge it and agree as a people. It's not to say Independence Day shit's going to happen, like War of the Worlds, but that is going to be something you just can't ignore anymore. And maybe little doses of this, like the Pentagon releasing that Navy footage or blue lights happening all over the world, or maybe little things. Because I don't know if it's always been there and just the spread of information is making it more prevalent, or more and more and more things that are not able to be explained so easily are starting to happen more and more and more.
I know that when I was probably 16, 17, I was hanging out with a friend. We were jumping outside on his trampoline and just looking up at the sky. And it wasn't blue lights or anything. I saw this weird, like red cloud type thing, and it didn't stay in one spot. It just moved. It was a clear night, no clouds in the sky at all. You see just the stars, and all of a sudden, there's this big red, huge, like red light that just moved around and then disappeared. I had no idea what that was. It freaked me out, but it also energized me too. I'm just like, well, hey, maybe there is something else out there that we don't know. And even going before that, back in 93, I think I was 15 at the time, the movie Fire in the Sky, which was Travis Walton. That movie scared the shit out of me, obviously. I mean, it was supposed to, but because the writers had to change a bunch of stuff up because they thought maybe, oh, this is just a boring ass story. It's just the same stuff that everybody else experiences. Let's make it worse. And so actually hearing him talk about his experience is a lot different, obviously, than the movie.
The whole sequence of him finding other human bodies being consumed and stuff like that, that never happened. Travis Walton never experienced that, anything like that. You know, when you go back and you look at the way that things were investigated, like in the 70s and in the 80s, versus how they are then investigated in the 90s, and then even by today's standards. I mean, not everything, but most things. There's kind of a purity in the way that the people doing the investigating would approach it. So I would always encourage people to go back through the archives and watch these old programs and watch the old investigations or the old interviews with people like Travis Walton and stuff like that. You know, because you were talking about green men earlier. You know, there's supposedly a breakdown of the various alien races that we are aware of, right? So there's the grays that have been talked about and popularized quite a bit. There's also the Nordic aliens. They're described as Nordic beings. They're usually large. They look almost kind of Viking-esque. They're sometimes called, I think they're called either the Palladians or the Venusians. That was a race that had been talked about from some people's accounts. And then, of course, you get into the other stuff that then people start to treat as a joke. And I can understand why. But then people talk about reptilians who disguise themselves as humans, you know. And then from there are other offshoots of those different types of races. Now, I don't know which of any of them are real or not. I can see from the outside point of view where it would all start to look a little bit comical, right? Because at the same time that we talk about aliens and UFOs, there is a truth when people say that, isn't it interesting how the years changed the way that we interpret spacecraft and the way that we interpret aliens, the way that we would describe them would change as well. But at the same time, there are certain things that never did change, right? So like when you talk about lights or cigar shapes or circles or triangles, there's certain things that have stayed consistent. And then even when you start talking about abductions, right? That was a big thing that was going on during the 90s, that people would talk about their abduction experiences. There were entire scientists and professors, who studied hypnosis, and whether you agree with the success of hypnosis or not, they would do therapies with people who claimed to be a continued abduction victim, like it started when they were a child and went on into their adulthood, even to the point when they would go to a doctor because they would have some kind of an inflammation, and then it would turn out that there'd be some kind of an artifact that would end up being extracted out of their body. And the artifact, it never really looked like anything like advanced technology, but it was usually of a mineral or some type of a metal type base that they didn't have an explanation for how it got embedded in the skin and stuff like that. You know, there's all these interesting aspects to all of this stuff that each one has its own little category. And I don't know if it's all connected or if it's not connected, or if this one part of it is just people getting ahead of themselves, or some people are perpetrating an absolute fraud. But when John talked about Travis Walton, that's why I say when you go back and you look at the historical stuff, the stuff that stands out, right? The Betty and Barney Hill, the Travis Walton. There are accounts that stand the test of time. And those are the ones that should always be looked at. I can understand where you can't take every account that you just hear, because then it turns into like Finding Bigfoot, right? Where that TV show was looking at the subject matter of Bigfoot. But every town they went into, somebody has an account of them running into a Bigfoot. And at a certain point, you just sat there and you like go, this is bullshit. This is all 100% bullshit.
With the Barney and Betty Hill, like I remember reading at one point that like they would revisit them for interviews later on in their life and everything, and their credibility from some of the interviews they said was decreasing because of, oh, you said this before when it was this and not this, and didn't take into account the fragmentation of memory recollection. But if you go back and read their like initial report, it's like it feels genuine and it feels real. I mean, they were coming back from Niagara Falls from vacation. There's no reason for them to have bullshit any of that.
Exactly, because they weren't living in an age where you needed to go and seek notoriety. And never mind the fact that they were an interracial couple. And even during that time, you didn't really go advertising your relationship in that regard or bringing a lot of attention to yourself. So the idea that this couple would want to go out and seek this kind of notoriety and have all this kind of investigation and eyes looking in on them. I mean, maybe one person might have the ego to do that, but to think that a couple would want to do that, no, that's never washed with me.
And I know we kind of touched on Project Blue Book earlier. And one thing that I kind of, as we've been talking about, like the 50s and the 60s and the 90s and, 2017, and it kind of seems like the eras that more information has been released publicly has also been around the same times as a war of some sort. Because in the 50s, when Project Blue Book was around, that was the beginning of the Korean War. And I kind of find that funny, and I might be grasping at straws, but kind of connecting that to what Ashley was saying about how it's like you'll sprinkle out this little bit of truth, but have all this other bigger domestic information that you're kind of covering over it.
And I know that people have talked about before where they've said that they believe that some part of the UFO concept is ultimately just disinformation to cover technology and black op projects and stuff like that. And so that would be in the interest of countries or nations during particular points where they didn't want the other side to know that they had some kind of advanced technology that they were using. So they would put out a story saying that, okay, there have been these rash of UFO sightings and stuff like that too. And I'm sure there may be some truth to some of that, but it doesn't explain the objects that behave in a way that just isn't possible. We do have advanced aircraft, but to say that we have advanced aircraft that break the laws of physics, right, that would absolutely have to be unmanned, because if you put a person in there, they'd be scrambled eggs. I mean, I can't buy 100% that countries or governments, that everything is all about disinformation. I'm sure they've used it, and I'm sure it's advantageous to use it, but at the same time, like when my father talked about it, the Air Force knew that there were things flying around in the sky that they didn't have an explanation for. But what the unsaid rule is that ignore it, don't talk about it, and don't repeat it. Move on. It's something that's beyond our understanding that we don't have an answer for. And you can't even look to your own government to truly know what the answer is, unless, of course, they did, in fact, have an actual crashed spacecraft, right? And what John was talking about, when John had talked about his personal experience, it almost feels like we now live in an age where that's what it comes down to. Where like the only way that you could know for sure if this is real or isn't real is your own personal experience. And then outside of that, there's nothing you can do, because you can't really go and convince somebody else about what was real to you.
It's interesting though, because there's a lot of stuff that doesn't get talked about that's even out there right now. There is a guy, Dr. Stephen Greer. He created the CE5 contact app. You're supposed to be able to theoretically use this app and make peaceful contact with extraterrestrial civilizations, as well as locating other people in the area who want to make contact too. So it's like find your buddy in the sky and find your buddy on Earth. And Demi Lovato made that app pretty popular because she went on one of his custom hiking trips to like Joshua Tree National Forest I believe, and spent like a week there and made supposed contact with aliens. But it was interesting because her verbiage is she went through guided meditation and using this app to make like a telepathic contact with extraterrestrials. And for me, I'm going to debunk this a little. And I don't know the app. I don't know, the person. So don't sue me, dude. But here's what I am where I'm at. If you're going through meditation, meditation is known to be a form of a hypnosis state. So if you are in a state of potential hypnosis and suggestion and you're using someone's app, I think you are under the influence of suggestion, guided suggestion. And if someone's out there physically with you to guide you through that, again, you're in a state of suggestion and hypnosis. And they use that. They use that for yoga nidra for PTSD trauma victims. They get put into guided hypnosis and then work through trauma to try and get rid of some of that PTSD scarring. So, with that said, I find it hard to believe there's an app out there that just helps you make connections with, aliens. But on top of that, if it's requiring you to go to a space of isolation into a hypnosis like state, what is actually happening there? I don't know. She said she felt great and she had answers to the world. But to me, it sounds like there's something else going on with that.
Yeah, I take exception with those because to me that falls into the category with the same type of apps that you have for ghost hunting. I tend to follow more the line of thinking of guys like Dr. Stephen Hawking. There have been scientists who've talked about like if there is alien life, what would they be like? The idea, like what you were talking about from some of these apps, where these people are like, well, I communed with an alien being, and he told me to love trees, and he told me to take care of flowers and to breastfeed crickets. You know, some scientists have looked at humans who are born like with either Asperger's or they have a genetic condition where they're gifted with an incredibly high intelligence, right? But that high intelligence that enables them to do something so incredibly amazingly, it comes with subtractions where like they don't have the same social norms that normal people do. The priorities are not the same as a normal person is. Not saying that they're evil or anything like that, but that with a higher intelligence, there seems to be something that takes place where the way that normal people think about just their normal day-to-day lives, daily morality, social customs, those don't seem to exist within these people, right? At least on a certain level. And so they've extrapolated that idea and talked about that if you were to encounter a race of beings, whatever they are, whether they're humanoid or if they're amoeba like, whatever it is, that if they are of such advanced technology and such advanced intelligence, that we couldn't even be thinking on the same terms, right? What is a priority for them wouldn't be a priority for us. What we consider important would not even be something that they consider. And I tend to agree with that because I would tend to think that if something is so advanced, how could we be thinking along the same lines? So those kinds of experiences I hear about, like there was a big, convention and everyone went out in the woods and they talked to Bebop and Bebop told them that, hey, you should all hold hands and love each other. I mean, that's all very nice and that's all very lovely, but I find it hard to believe that a being would be traveling millions of light years to tell everyone to hold hands. The idea that something so advanced is thinking in the way that we think, right? That we're such, and like you talked about before, we're kind of an infant species. We have all of our geopolitical divisions, we have our ideological divisions, we have our spiritual divisions. I mean, we kill each other, we rape each other, we do all kinds of things. So to think that an alien species that is advanced enough to get here from another solar system is going to be thinking the way that we do, I don't see that happening. I literally feel like it's like me trying to have a conversation with an ant. And I'm not degrading the ant. I'm just saying that our minds and our philosophies are worlds apart.
Doesn't it make you wonder how, in such a short amount of time, our brains developed from that basic caveman, Neanderthal, to now we're flying planes and rockets to outer space, and just the level of that brain development? Like our entire body supported that development, right? Our skull changed shape. It's amazing to see the evolution of our biology to accommodate that. But that hasn't happened for every species on this earth, right? It's not like lions are walking around drinking cups of tea and saying, hey, you want to meet at Starbucks tomorrow? It doesn't happen to everything. So it makes you wonder why that specific line of species, right? Why us? What made us so different? Because we all started crawling out of the ocean as little like amoebas the same. So what made it different? That evolution happened in such a short amount of time, but it's not necessarily happening at the same rate with other species. That's not saying that it doesn't happen with other species. We see other species evolving slowly. Like there are other primates out there that are learning to build and use tools and cunning and behavioral conditioning from different mammals that occurs out there. So it's a thing, but ours just happened at such an intense rate. And if you extrapolate that rate onto a species that's maybe been around a couple of thousand years longer, like you said, holy cow, where are the brains at? Where's the intellectual thought process at that level? It's just, I can't even like fathom that. The idea that they're gonna, swipe right on an alien Tinder app and come tell you to breastfeed crickets just does not sound realistic. And I'm with you. And that's where I tend to struggle with this idea that you can have an app that helps you talk to these aliens. Like they're gonna pull out their iPhone and like, oh, Ashley's trying to talk to me again. Hold up, let me text her back. It just doesn't sound like it makes sense to me. Nobody's ever said I saw this spaceship just like fly down and then over. Like a lot of the descriptions are just poof, it's there. So how are they, hypothetically speaking, if aliens and UFOs are real, how are they appearing in our atmosphere on our Earth?
That opens up a whole other can of worms. At the same time that we're having a reasoned conversation about this stuff, during the period of time in the decades, the idea of aliens and UFOs would also be debated in terms of theology, where you would have groups of people who ascribe that aliens or UFOs are demons, right? And so they're coming from Satan and stuff like that. And then at the same time, you have other people saying that, well, they're not really interplanetary beings, but they're interdimensional beings. And so that they're coming to us from another dimension, or that maybe they are our own race, our own species from somewhere else in the timeline, and they're coming through a continuum or through a portal, and they're visiting us, and they're trying to, either correct something or change something. It's a Pandora's box that you open up. I subscribe to both. I don't doubt that there could be something that could travel interdimensionally. I don't doubt that there are other dimensions. But I also don't doubt the possibility that something that is so advanced could be traveling here from another solar system as well. So I would like to hope and think that they're not demons and that it's the end of the world. That would suck because I don't really know what you would do about that. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a definitive answer one way or the other for every single account, for every single object. Where does it come from? How did it get here? I don't know.
And it could be a mix of all of the above.
One of the things that Ashley, you had talked about, there's another guy, maybe you guys are aware of him. There's kind of an author, kind of a archaeologist, a historian named Graham Hancock. And he's written some great books, but Graham Hancock has spent most of the years of his life investigating ancient cultures and dig sites where they have discovered like monoliths or societal structures that were created by societies that had advanced technology. So when you were talking about the idea about like where we are in terms of our intelligence as a species, like where we were 100 years ago versus where we are now, Graham Hancock has asked, now he's not running out there saying that everything is by alien beings, but what he's brought up is that if you look at the historical record and you go to these dig sites, you will find the remnants of these cities that were designed and engineered and built using sciences that technically should not have existed. These are remnants of civilizations that had such knowledge that there's no explanation for it. So then the question comes, where did the knowledge come from? It's not like we just woke up one day and we figured out how to build a pyramid, right? Or we woke up one day and we figured out how to make laser smooth cuts in stones and then slab them together. So it brings up the whole thing of like, are there beings that have visited us in the past that did give us knowledge or a basic understanding of things to try to help us to move along? Is that possible? Is it us? Did we come back in time interdimensionally and try to help pre-existing society or whatnot? I mean, again, this all starts to sound like science fiction or like it's an episode of some kind of crazy TV show. But from 1921 to 2021, how did we get here? A guy walking around in 1921 If he was looking at my iPad right now, he would think I was a witch or something. That kind of a jump within that amount of time, how do you explain that? Is it what we're doing now? Is it an example of something that was done again before in the past, either by ourselves or by someone else? I know I sound kooky, but
I'm about to sound kookier because sometimes I think, we discuss this when it comes to creativity. Like when you wake up and suddenly there is, for those who are writers, a full story in your head and you have no idea where it came from and it is bursting to get out. Like it is the full story and it just appeared in your brain and it needs to be told. And it's just like, holy cow, where did that even come from? And it happens a lot to musicians. They sometimes hear a melody, and sometimes it doesn't even feel like it's coming from you. And you see that with like creatives where the same story suddenly pops up in different places. And it's like, well, who told it first? Because that's who's going to get it sold first. This concept that's just coming up, or songs or melodies. And we see that happen, especially in the creative world, because it's a recording of something, right? So we can actually physically see the story pop up in different places and similarities, or very similar sounding songs popping up in different areas. And it's like, oh, someone's copying. And it's like, no, I don't think so. So the question is, where does that inspiration come from? Is there some kind of like cosmic awareness or cosmic consciousness that we occasionally drift off and tap into that has all of that in there, whether it's a story or a song or how to build something or inventions? Is there something that some of us are more predispositioned to tap into? Like maybe as a writer, my tuning fork vibrates to that. And so I receive that and it comes out in that way. Or the musician receives that in the form of like a melody and it comes through that way, and so forth. So then you have your Stephen Hawkings, or you have your Albert Einsteins, or just all of those people that do things that it's like, how the heck did their brain even just like generate that idea? Or like the Darwins who understood like, species evolution and biology. And it's just like, where do these people get that from? And to your point, did someone deliver that to them? Or is there some kind of like cosmic consciousness? And I mean, extending further than our Earth, that we are able to sometimes vibrationally tap into, like our own, we're all little tuning forks, and some of us are tuned to different frequencies more so than others. I don't know. That's kind of sometimes where my brain goes when I think about those jumps. But again, I circle back to, why just us? Why is that not happening to lions or tigers or bears? Oh my.
Something that I think about is, okay, so we talked about the multiple dimensions and all that, time travel even maybe. But if we were to be able to come back into a specific time, wouldn't that mean that the time machine had already existed in that time? Because we can only go back as far as time machine exists, right? So I don't know. It's confusing to me too. But it's just something that I was thinking.
Unless the technology that they develop or they find is a technology that can access something about the universe that we don't understand. If there's a technology that's created because there's an understanding that develops far into the future about the universe, and that maybe that there are pathways, there are like arteries or veins that connect dimensionally or time periods, and that the technology allows you to access that. And so then you can still use the artery system to then travel back and forth. Oh, but then again, who knows? I mean, I could imagine a thing where perhaps, and again, this is crazy stuff, right? If it's whether it's an alien race, or if it's us, or if it's an alien race traveling from the future coming into the past, would it be possible that, and people have talked about this before, that within the alien races, that they have their own drones, right? That they have a species beneath them that are either autonomous, but they're basically, they don't have the will, they don't have a soul, as it were, and they perform functions. So my idea is that I could imagine, if there is some sort of goal of some sort of race in a future or whatnot, that wants to either do something or implement something or see something or record something from somewhere on our planet, in our past, in our time, that they could create something that could go one way. And that one-way object comes here, it does what it needs to do. It has a way to transmit information to where it needs to go, but maybe it's a one-way trip. and maybe they don't get to go back. So then that mission, it dies, it self-destructs, whatever the case may be. When you really stop and you start thinking about all the things that you could do, that could happen, that a society or a race would do or whatnot, I mean, that becomes almost as limitless as you just trying to get the basic answer to the question of, is like, are UFOs real? Is an alien race real? I've come to the conclusion for myself that I'll never know the answer unless, of course, something comes and lands right in front of me. I've spent my entire life listening and reading and watching all kinds of documentation and all kinds of accounts. And it's always grabbed my imagination, and it's always made me think. It's always made me ask questions, but it's never provided an absolute 100% certifiable answer for myself. But I'm not arrogant enough to think that I have all the answers. And I'm never arrogant enough to think that when I hear people say, like, well, no, we're the only living things in the universe. To me, that is the utmost hubris and arrogance that I think I could imagine.
Well, and I think to your point, arrogance plays a big piece. A lot of people say, well, if extraterrestrials were real, they would have made contact by now. They would have talked to us by now. And it's just like, well, yeah, maybe, but that's a lot of assumption on the idea that they want to contact us. They want to talk to us. Because if they're so evolved that they can visit us whenever they like, because we can't hop on over, to other solar systems whenever we like. That's like thousands of years away. That's not within our technological capabilities. So it's not an easy Sunday for us, right? It's not a day hike. This idea that a species that is so advanced that they can come day trip over to Earth whenever they like is gonna, well, I'm coming just to talk to you people. I don't know, because that's to me like I'm not gonna hike to the forest to talk to a snail.
A species could be interested in another species and still not want to get involved,
And not contact them. I don't know. I just, and what if this idea, like you were saying, that like we don't understand necessarily how the universe is sculpted to begin with. We have kind of ideas, but we haven't really been able to get much out of our galaxy and our solar system. So who's to say the universe isn't folded over? Space-time isn't folded over. That concept has been out there a lot. And that whole, they appear pretty quickly and then disappear. Right? Who's to say they're not coming in and out of those interdimensional layers and we're just layered over one another, and they've figured out how to pop through and pop back out. And I'll go ahead and say, what if it's just an adventure for them? Like for us, something may seem crazy, like you said, the whole iPad. If someone from the 1920s came over and saw that we were flying on planes willingly to go 2 states away and we're in these fast electric cars, this cars powered on pure electricity and the things we do for fun. People skydive for fun and all of these things. It's like that would blow their minds. So who's to say that aliens aren't having their own little adventures? Like this is like us going to Hawaii. They're blipping through time space. Like, well, I think I'm going to visit Earth today and eat a cow. I don't know.
I mean, what makes sense to me, and I know it may sound a little bit crazy, but it would make sense to me that there are different races, that there are different species that have come here at various points of time throughout the existence of this planet and the different types of organisms that lived here. You could be a race that had visited this planet at one point in time and you saw a bunch of dinosaurs. And then the next time you came back, you see us. And that would be kind of like, okay, what's going on there? What happened there? To me, it would make sense just the way that we are, the way that we exist within our own planet. I could totally see how that would work universally. When you have different creatures that become aware of other creatures, people visit different ecosystems, this constant peering back and forth through, what's going on over there on a cosmic scale. I don't necessarily think that there's one single other alien race that's 100 million light years in that direction. To me, it makes sense that throughout the history of time, and even before we were here, and probably long after we're gone, that you will have just a scattering of different beings, different races reaching out and making their own journeys and discoveries and adventures, like you said. Ashley, when you had started, you talked about before at the very beginning about like the star people and stuff like that too. There's all those concepts of like the, what we talk about as angels, that those were in fact alien visitors and that they came down to our planet, that they, for whatever reason, decided to breed with human females and then created a new species in and of itself. What if the whole purpose of visitations or abductions or any of that is for simple things like that, just for the propagation of a race, the continuation of a species, and maybe not a species here, but to take something back that enables them to continue their species.
Or we're petri dishes in guinea pigs and something else is observing and watching us. And that's what we are. That's why they pop in and out to see if their science experiment is going as they anticipated. Now who sounds crazy?
Well, it's not. That's a theory that's been put forward too, that we are an experiment.
So where do we stand? Aliens are real?
I believe that there is life outside of Earth. So be aliens, sure.
And do they visit us? UFOs?
I'm not sure where I stand on that. Like, there's kind of circling back to everything that we've talked about. Like, there's been so many similar reportings throughout history that coincide with each other, even before the time of easy communication. And so I can't discredit that.
If you just think about it, we are just now going into space trying to see what's out there. Who's to say that something else out there isn't doing the exact same thing? So I think they definitely visit us to see what the heck's going on and what's out there.
For me, it's pretty simple, you know, because again, I always go back to my childhood. I go back to talking to my dad and stuff like that. Do I believe it's the way that Hollywood portrays it? No, I don't. But yes, I do believe that there has to be alien life. And I do believe that we have been visited, and I do believe that we are visited, and I'm sure we'll be visited in the future. And I almost view whatever could be out there, I view it as being very detached, right? I'm not saying that they're evil or anything like that, but I'm just saying that it's operating on a level that, you know, we're just not at. And so, you know, we're apples and oranges. But I believe that they exist, and I believe that the visitations have happened. That doesn't mean I believe every single account that has ever been popped up in media or pulp culture, but I do believe that in human history, we have had contact. I believe that we have had some kind of interaction with probably more than one.
And how about you, Ashley?
I absolutely believe that there is life outside of our galaxy, outside of our solar system, on more than one planet. I think there's multiple types of life out there at different levels of advancement. Some maybe in their infancy, like us, some just starting to crawl out of the ocean, their own little oceans, some way further along. I think that we've got lots of different things going on in other galaxies and other solar systems throughout multiple universes, maybe. I don't know. I do think that we've been visited at times. I sometimes wonder if maybe that's how some of our species has had their jump start in certain areas of technology, creativity, and advancement. I also wonder if we are a natural part of the evolution of this earth, or if maybe we were a deposited species ourselves that,
Mhm.
kind of carried along and grew with the other ecosystems. Everything else seems to be growing along with each other's pace. Animals, vegetation, water, all of that stuff seems to be growing at the same pace of evolution. We're kind of on our own little track. So sometimes wonder about that a little bit. In a lot of the accounts, people talk about green men, gray men, all these UFO aliens, but no one's ever talked about the gear that they're wearing because it doesn't sound like they're wearing gear. But if you're from another planet, like the whole idea of science is when you go into a planet, you have to follow its laws of gravity because that's how the planet is. That's why we have to create special gear when we go to the moon or we go to Mars because we can't just like, well, I'm human. So now that I'm on this planet, all my human stuff just can operate here. Like we have to adapt to whatever that atmosphere is like, right? And we have to create gear to help us support what that planet has in terms of gravity and what their atmosphere is created from and their oxygen levels, because that's how our body is created to subsist on our planet, not other planets. So if these aliens are visiting us from their planets, unless they're exactly like Earth, like in terms of gravity and in terms of like chemical makeup, their biological makeup, wouldn't they need something to protect them to be able to vacation here?
Well, there are some people who have posited that, in particular with grays, that the grays are in fact a suit, that the
Oh.
grays are an external apparatus that contains a separate being inside. It is a concept that has come up before.
If we're considering people to be, or aliens to be human-like to the point where they've got brains that are thinking and creating and functioning, brains have to be supported by certain things, right? Computer systems, by some sort of energy source. Maybe not the same energy source as us. Like our brains need oxygen and blood, and there's a lot of things our brain needs. And so, assuming their brains work like a computer like ours, would need their own system to help keep it running, right? So it just makes me wonder what they would need to be able to even exist on our planet, even just visiting. And so I like your point that the gray is actually a suit, because then that may also, account for the green men, or whatever color you hear, because they're wearing suits, it's not their skin.
And the other thing that comes up too is size. There have been accounts of UFOs that have been fairly small in size, right? Smaller than a human body, right? And so that brings up another question where it's like when you're asking yourself, these different alien life forms, what sizes could they be? What masses could they be? Are they humanoid? Are they like either a raccoon, or are they like a chimpanzee, or are they of a different type of organism, right? The stuff we've been talking about too has been talking about alien races with technology that primarily seem to revolve around like flying saucers or technology in that regards. But there's also the school of thought talking about aliens and alien beings that would exist like amoebas, right? That they just drift in space, that they're not bound by a technology. They don't have a physical form the way that we have a physical form, whether they're gelatinous or if they're a form of organic rock or crystalline or whatever it may be.
When I know even with our own evolution, we see different sizes, right? Who knows? Maybe there's aliens out there, alien life forces that are thousands of years in advance from us, and they don't need to be that big. So they've gone through their evolution of tall to small, and it just benefits them to be smaller at this point for survival. Because I do believe whether you're on Earth or whether you're on Mars or whether you're on planet K52, survival of the species is going to be within every single species. Gosh, that was a lot of rambling. Whew. Guys, this was a great, really like engaging, intriguing episode. I really appreciate you coming on, David. That was phenomenal
thank you.
conversation. Yeah. Like you brought so much insight into stuff I had no idea about.
Well, I don't know about that, but I thank you guys for having me. And it was a pleasure, John and Kevin, to be able to meet you and to talk to you. And again, like I said, it is a great conversation, but it's that thing where you realize it's like this is a conversation that you can keep coming back to and having again and again and again, because there's no way that you are ever going to reach the end of this.
So you'll come back and do a follow-up episode where we go on about it again and again and again.
Well, no, if you guys want me to, I'd be more than happy to, for sure.
Sweet. Yes. And we can talk about the pop culture side of it too, because we only touched on that a little. And I'm all about pop culture, how the idea of extraterrestrials has influenced and helped shape our pop culture. So yay. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And is there anything you'd like to shout out to before we go off? Any of your projects or anything you're working on?
There's an episode that we're working on, which is a part of our project where we kind of satire this kind of stuff, which is called Bizarrely Factuous. It addresses, there's an author by the name of Edmund Monteague, who is kind of a Bigfoot researcher, but he has put forward theories about things that have happened with alien races, and that alien races in fact brought Bigfoots and bears to the planet Earth. And so that's something that we're going to be exploring.
And where can we find those episodes?
Well, the Bizarrely Factuous, you can find that just by typing that into YouTube.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the show. I had a fantastic time with you.
Well,
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you for tuning in to the 3Haunted podcast with your hosts. I'm Ashley.
I am your co-host, John Thomas.
I'm Kevin K. Daddy.
You have any questions or suggestions? Email us at 3hauntedpodcast@gmail.com. Also, don't forget to like us on our social media. Hit that follow button.